Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is the next instalment of our Career Profile season for 2024. Now, this is about a character who was a boxing trainer, a manager, a boxing promoter, someone who handled 19 world champions, and someone as part of a bigger family who also was able to produce great shows. They was able to put great boxing events on in over 20 countries in 6 continents, and this individual was inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame. This individual is the legendary Lou Duva. And in this episode, we're going to document all of his beginnings, all of his stories, his entrepreneurship, everything that he did throughout his life. And as a result of that, it will be split into multiple parts, this being the first part of the Lou Duva career profile. Now, before I get into this story, I want to take a moment to thank you all for supporting us on our journey and letting us know what you're thinking about us on social media. Big shout out to the patrons on Patreon for subscribing to us separately and getting these episodes early. And please continue to make sure you're leaving comments. If you're on Spotify, leave a comment below. If you're on Apple, leave a rating, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, I'll leave a comment below. Please continue to do it because it is really helping us gauge what you guys are really enjoying. So thank you very much for that. And now, without further ado, I will go into the story of Lou Duva. And it all began when Louis Daniel Duva came out of his mother's womb swinging on the 28th of May, 1922. He said, "I probably stuck the nurse with a stiff jab and then flattened the doctor with a right cross. The odds are that they booted me from the hospital and fined me a couple of milk bottles." A child of Italian immigrants, he wasn't born with a golden rattle or wrapped in a silk blanket. He knew that fighting would become imperative from an early age. And he said, "Looking back, I wouldn't have had it any other way. Fighting my way through life has made it an interesting, fun ride, bumps and bruises included. Of course, when I was growing up, I would have liked to have lived in a big mansion with fine furniture and all the food you could have eaten. But then I probably wouldn't have had the many great experiences I've had. Growing up, we were so poor that I recall times when we had to use wooden crates for furniture, tables and chairs. If you got a hole in your shoe, you'd better find some newspaper to stuff in that hole, or the water and cold would be your foot's best friend." There weren't a lot of luxuries for a family with 7 kids. That was a big family even back then. There were a lot of us, but there was always plenty of love to go around. Lou was the youngest of 5 children, born in Manhattan's Mulberry Street near Broome in Little Italy, where most Italian immigrants settled once they had arrived in America. Lou's father, Salvatore, and his mother, Severia, were born in Italy's Foggia region, in the southern eastern part of the country. It is universally known that as Italy's breadbasket, as it is where the country stores its grain. Lou's parents, well, they knew a lot about bread, and they also knew how they wanted it buttered with the rich promises of the American dream. So when they got the chance, they boarded a ship and headed to America, making the same long cross-the-Atlantic Ocean trip that thousands of Italians made in the 1920s. Like mostly everyone else who made that trip, Lou's parents arrived with nothing more than a desire to have a better life and the willingness to work hard to get it. They came to America with only one child, Lou's older brother Carl. He said, "I don't remember much about living in Little Italy. My earliest memories are of my father taking us to Coney Island to cool off during those hot summer days. And on hot nights, because our apartment, which was on the 5th floor, was so small and cramped, he'd sit me outside on the fire escape. If it happened to rain, I'd start to cry to come inside. And he told me just to pretend that I was still on the beach at Coney Island with the waves coming in. 'Enjoy yourself,' he'd say, laughing." Lou's father was small in stature, but he was a big man in Lou's eyes. To Lou, his true measure had more to do with the fact that he worked so hard to provide for them. Jobs were scarce, and you had to have connections with relatives and close friends to get one. So his dad had to hustle every day. And if you didn't find work, not only did you go hungry, but everyone in your house did as well. And with all those little mouths to feed, Lou's father busted his hump trying to find work and earning enough to keep them all going. To get steady work, Salvatore decided it was best to move the family to New Jersey. One of the jobs he took on was working at the textile mills in New Jersey dyeing fabrics. In 1926, the Duvas relocated to another Little Italy neighbourhood situated in Paterson, New Jersey. Lou said it was the best move we could have made. He also said it was the beginning of my story. It might not look like it today, but Paterson was a happening place when we moved there in 1926. Called Silk City, it was one of the earliest manufacturers of that fabric in the US. It was also one of the first cities in America involved in the Industrial Revolution. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury for President George Washington, called for the city to be built as a centre of manufacturing. He even built the Colt gun factory there. In the late 1920s, if you were willing to work hard, you could earn a living in Paterson. Lou's family filled out to 7 kids when they landed in Paterson. Lou said, my 2 younger sisters, Anna and Josephine, were born there. That meant more mouths to feed, which meant my father had to work even harder. He continued to say, to earn a living, my father worked in textile dye house factories for 10 to 12 hours a day. During that time, my mother took care of things at home, cooking and watching over us to make sure we didn't get in trouble or kill each other. Later, my older brother Carl, who we called Count, went to work at the dye factory as well. It was hard, dirty labour, but it put bread on the table. My 2 older sisters later worked at Barbizon, which manufactured ladies' lingerie. It wasn't all hard work though. Like all Italian families, we loved to eat and drink. My father was something of an expert winemaker. At least, that's what the people in the neighbourhood said. He had a winemaking machine in the basement of our house, which never stayed idle. He was always buying grapes and making wine, and whenever he'd start a new batch, the neighbours, somehow, always found out. And soon enough, we'd have half the neighbourhood over, drinking and playing cards. Lou and his family, well, they moved quite a bit around in Paterson. The parents were always trying to beat the rent. It became like a game, trying to stay one step ahead of an angry landlord. There was one place that they lived that Lou liked best. That was on Pine Street. They lived next door to a black family, and he got close to their son, Joe Medlin. He said he was a tall kid and he had a great singing voice. He also tried to teach Lou how to sing, but he said he wasn't any good at it. He had a lot of talent and he ended up playing with the Buddy Johnson band when he got older. Well, that experience with Joe Medlin, it taught Lou how to get along with people of all backgrounds. Black, white, red, yellow, green. Race, well, it didn't matter to Lou. If you were a solid guy, you were a solid guy. It was a lesson that would serve Lou well as he went along in life. From his time in the army to working with various amateur and professional boxers from around the world. He said he loved playing sports and he considered himself a pretty good athlete. He said, I played football and softball during my time at Central High School in Paterson. I even played some semi-pro football for a while. Those were my 2 favourite sports. If it hadn't have been for my brother Carl, I don't know if I would have even gotten involved with boxing. It was him who got me started. Carl was 13 years older than Lou and was already an accomplished boxer by the time he took Lou along to the gym in 1932. Carl was Lou's hero. He would pack his brother's gym bag in the readiness for his arrival home from work at the textile factory. The second he walked in the door, the 2 of them would head straight to the gym. There were gyms all over Paterson back then. Sometimes they'd go to Al Capone's gym. Not the Al Capone, but a family named Capone that had a popular gym on Sunny Road. They went to the American Athletic Club on West Broadway most often. They had a good middleweight named Benny Colino and a Jewish heavyweight named Roy Glazer who worked out there. Plus, most bars back then had an area in the back just for boxing. Guys would get off work, they'd go and have a drink at the bar in the front, and then they'd go to the back and box. Lou said, I guess it was better than breaking up the place with a bar fight. One of the best places for boxing those days was an outdoor spot on Upper Market Street where they'd have events once a week, usually on a Saturday. It was a family event. People would pack up all kinds of Italian food and drink and go to the fights like a big outing. He went on to say, my brother Carl and all the guys for the Al Capone gym would fight there. To draw a bigger crowd, they would match guys up by nationalities. They would have Italians fighting Irishmen and Jewish fighting Italians. People really got into it. You'd see guys smoking and drinking and hollering. It was a crazy scene. Carl was a tough son of a gun. He would stand toe-to-toe with a guy in the middle of the ring, and if the guy backed off, he'd stand there and he'd start waving his hands. Come on, let's fight, he would yell. He got beat up some, but he won more than he lost. With his style, every fight was a tough one. The crowd loved him. They loved the way he fought. I guess today they'd call it the Mexican style of fighting. It's funny how those things work from generation to generation. He became a local star. Everyone wanted him to fight on their card because he could bring in a crowd. Lou was filing away notes about how boxing operated. Even then, he was learning what you needed to do to build a star and how to attract a crowd, and also how to make a good show that people could enjoy. I guess what you could say is that he got inspired to box by watching his brother Carl. Lou became serious about boxing when at the age of 14 years old, Carl became Lou's first boxing tutor. In terms of competitive pursuits, Lou featured in the Paterson News Diamond Gloves, which was run by the editor of the local newspaper, Abe Green, who also happened to be the New Jersey boxing commissioner. Green was one of the most prominent figures in boxing in New Jersey, and while commissioner during the 1930s, he helped clean up the sport by eradicating the fake mob organised matches that were plaguing the sport in the area at that time. Lou, in being trained by his brother, would adopt his attack-minded fighting style, which didn't make for career longevity as either amateur or pro in a professional career that just spanned 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. On the benefits that competing brought him, Lou Duva said, boxing taught me that I didn't have to back down from anybody. What I loved most was it gave me the confidence to stand my ground, even with the wise guys who mouthed off to me. The more I learnt, the more I loved it. Carl taught me how to move in and out, and how to punch, and most importantly, how to avoid a punch. But mainly, I learned by watching other guys in the gym and picking up things they did. I discovered that I was a good student of the sport. Unfortunately, I wasn't a good student of anything else. I stunk at school. The joke I always tell is that I had to leave school because of pneumonia. Not because I had it, but because I couldn't spell it. It had nothing to do with Lou not being smart or intelligent. Lou just didn't want to be there. He said, maybe if I applied myself to studying math or science as much as I applied myself to hustling, I could have been a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant. But that didn't seem important to me at the time. To me, the only important thing was boxing. At about the same time that I was entering into the boxing world, I was working several jobs to help out my family. I felt like I had to earn my keep as my brothers and sisters were already working. Plus studying books and sitting in class just weren't cutting it for me, as I was always tired by the time I got to school each day from working and boxing. At night, I sold the New York Daily News and the Daily Mirror on street corners. I could be on those corners until midnight. After that, I'd go down to McNear's bowling alley to set up pins for a couple of hours. You could take home a few extra dollars if you caught that late tavern crowd. I was getting home at 3 or 4 in the morning, catching a couple of hours shut-eye before heading off to school, so it was no surprise that I'd be falling asleep in class. It didn't help the situation any that Lou was also mouthing off to the teachers. He just wanted no part of what they wanted him to do or say or how to act. Lou wanted to do the things that he wanted to do and be the way he wanted to be. I guess what you could say is that he was rebellious. He had this one teacher that he said, Mrs. Wolfe, who was always on him. He said whenever we'd get into class, she'd take me out into the hallway and slap the shit out of me. I'd come back into class and the other kids would be laughing. Lou, you took another one. This went on for a while, and it was the same thing almost every day. Lou going to school, falling asleep, mouthing off to teachers, and getting slapped for it. Finally, he just had enough, and he just stopped going, dropping out in his first year at Central High School. He said, I don't really regret it. School was the farthest thing from my mind at the time. It just wasn't as important as making money to help my family. It also wasn't as important as boxing. Without the burden of having to go to school every day, I was free to seek other money-making opportunities. And I did it, with the gusto of a hungry man attacking a bowl of pasta. I developed a pretty good routine. I'd get up at 6 a.m, hitch a ride to the Preakness Hills County Club in Wayne, New Jersey, and caddy for the doctors and the lawyers. They always got there early to get in 18 holes before going to work. Those guys were high rollers to me. I could get $1.25 a round, and that was a lot of money for a kid back in those days. But that wasn't the end of my day, not by a long stretch. I was just getting started. Around 11 a.m, I'd hitch a ride up to Pompton Lakes to Doc Beer's training camp. If Joe Louis was training there, I knew it was going to be a great day for me. I got to know Joe and his trainer Jack Blackburn. Joe made sure that Jack took care of me. He'd say, "Get this kid a sandwich, Shappy. Make sure he gets something to eat." Blackburn introduced Lou Duva to Joe Louis when the heavyweight champion first started working at Doc Beer's training camp. Lou said, Joe was the kind of guy who treated everyone he met like they were an old friend. From going to his camp so much, Joe readily recognised me when I showed up at his training camp. Joe Louis was the ideal vision of what a heavyweight champion should look like. Bigger than life, but not so big that he didn't have time for the little people. He made you feel like you were included in his group, that you belonged. Joe was a great guy. Whenever there was a kid getting into trouble in the area, someone would drag him over to see Joe, who would scare him to death. I guess you could say that Joe ran the first Scared Straight program. Joe could set you straight if you were going in the wrong direction. Besides helping the local kids, Joe did a lot for the community. When someone passed away because the ambulance from a nearby town didn't arrive in time, Joe held an exhibition to raise the $2,600 that was needed so that the town of Pompton Lakes could buy its own ambulance. He also raised $2,000 to help the town's police department build a communication tower. That's why later in life, Lou said, I helped raise funds to build the Joe Louis Memorial Park in Pompton Lakes. He'd always make time for the local kids, even opening his camp up and letting them run around. On Sundays, there would be 5,000 people up there to watch him work out on his outdoor ring, under the big trees of the camp. He'd go to the schools and he'd speak to the kids. He ran movie trips and always picked up the tab, even for the ice cream. He made sure that people up there were taken care of if they were down and out. He loved watching Joe train. He said he wore those white knit trunks and that white tank top with the black shoes and the white socks. When he was in the ring, it was all business. For Lou, watching Joe was the greatest education he could have ever gotten. Forget about falling asleep in class, seeing Joe Louis move around the ring and sparring. It was like getting a PhD in the sweet science. It was truly a thing of beauty to see Joe bob and weave and avoid punches. When Joe wasn't there training, the camp was home to some of the greatest boxers of the day. Fighters like Jackie Kid Berg, Harry Greb, Benny Leonard, Pancho Villa, Tony Canzonieri, Jimmy McLarnon, Lou Brilliard and Primo Carnera. They were all boxing royalty back then. The training camp was like a stop at Buckingham Palace, yet more fun. Now, after leaving the camp, Lou would go straight to the American Athletic Club gym in Paterson and practice what he saw Joe do in camp, along with what Carl was teaching him. He'd put his skills to good use and try him in some of his amateur fights. Of those experiences, Lou said, after my time in the gym, I'd get back out on the streets at nights to sell newspapers, shine shoes, and set up bowling pins. Then I'd get up the next day and do it all over again. I was 15, doing exactly what I wanted to do, without anyone telling me otherwise. I felt like I could conquer the world, but I was also getting restless, and as the Great Depression was gripping the nation, I was feeling more pressure to help my family. I knew there was something more that I needed to be doing. I had to find a way to earn more money. Lucky for me, I discovered a way to earn more money, while at the same time calming the sense of helplessness that was growing inside of me. The Civilian Conservation Corps would end up being the answer. In 1938, America was in the grip of the Great Depression. The poorest of the population were bearing the brunt of it, especially with the Duva family being no exception. Lou would have many jobs during this time, selling the newspapers, shining the shoes, setting the bowling pins up and caddying for rich golf players. but none of these side hustles were enough to adequately supplement the family. Lou knew he had to do something more substantial to bring in the extra funds. He found employment with a government works programme of the time called the Civilian Conservation Corps. The scheme was put in place by President Franklin D. Roosevelt as part of his New Deal to stimulate the ailing US economy. Unemployed and unmarried young men who had trouble finding jobs during the Great Depression were targeted as workers by the Corps. Under the programme, young men were offered shelter, clothing and food, along with $30 a month. 3 billion trees were planted and 800 national parks were built. Lou would earn $30, of which he kept 5, with the remaining 25 being sent home to his Duva family. And he said, for a restless kid from Paterson, New Jersey, it seemed like a big adventure. But I wasn't too concerned about that. I could make my own fun in Paterson. I was more interested in the $30 and the potential opportunities to hustle and make more money. It was a great idea, but there were 2 problems with this plan. My parents didn't want me to leave, and I was only 16 years old, which was 2 years too young to legally join the CCC at the time. A few years later, they changed the age requirements to 17 to 28. I begged my parents to let me join the CCC. As with most parents, they were concerned about me leaving home. They thought I was too young, which I was. Eventually, I wore them down and they agreed. I think they thought I wasn't going to be allowed to join because I was too young, so by agreeing, they were giving me what I wanted, but knew the law would keep me from actually getting in. Well, little did they know that I already had a plan to get around that little age issue. I managed to convince this guy, who was 2 years older than me, to give me his birth certificate. I changed the name on it, and no one was none the wiser. It was a good enough forgery to even fool the US government, as they let me join the CCC. I became one of the 3 million young men who planted more than 1 billion trees from 1933 to 1942. I had no idea where I would end up. Since most of the work in the CCC was about planting trees and building parks, I thought I'd still end up in New Jersey. I mean, it wasn't called the Garden State for nothing. Well, instead of keeping me close to home, they shipped me all the way across the country to Walla Walla, Washington. I guess they needed more trees in Walla Walla than in New Jersey. For a kid who had never been farther than Manhattan, travelling across the country from Paterson to Walla Walla was like going from the Earth to Mars. Walla Walla, which is a Native American meaning, place of many waters, it was a beautiful place in the southeast Washington state, a few miles north of the Oregon border. It's famous for its sweet onions and actor Adam West, who played Batman in the 1960s. The town sits in a valley of the Blue Mountains and near the Cascade Mountains, and the Walla Walla River empties into the Columbia River. For a kid from the city, the rural setting, it was a lot to get used to, but Lou was able to adapt to the situation. Plus, he figured there was going to be opportunities to pick up some extra loot if he could get a couple of good hustles going. So he learnt how to drive trucks, which would come in handy when he started his trucking business later in life. He was driving trucks between Walla Walla, Washington and Boise, Idaho by day. He was also taking correspondence courses to try and learn some of the stuff that he didn't learn in school. The CCC camp was run like the US Army. They actually had officers in charge, which you had to address as Sir. What it did do is it helped instill some discipline, because you towed the line. You wanted to earn money, and the alternative would have been getting booted out and not going back with nothing. What you had to do was do your work during the day and blow off steam at night. So Lou learned how to play craps, and he got pretty good at it. And it also wasn't long before the guys in camp found out that he could box. What would happen is they would hold these smokers in the back rooms at the local bars. So Lou ended up fighting most of them before his time was through. He said, I could get $5, $8, or even $12 a bout, depending on who I fought. And I was claiming extra money because I was coaching the other guys. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was a pretty good bullshit artist, and they thought I knew what I was talking about. I was using all the information that my brother had taught me, and it made me look like an expert. These guys who had never boxed a day in their lives didn't know the difference. Then one day, the owner of one of the bars we used to fight in made me a proposition. You know how to coach, and you know how to fight. Do you want to box in an exhibition? Well, Lou hesitated for a second, and he said, we'll give you $50. And that was it. Once Lou had heard the $50, he was in. He said, you got me, pal. He thought it was going to be the easiest money he'd ever earned. $50 was a lot of money back then. It was almost 2 months' wages. When he thought about the offer, something in Lou's head told him it wasn't going to be easy money. There must have been some sort of catch. So he asked the guy, who am I supposed to fight? The response was, Lou Jenkins. And he said it as if it was just some guy who'd fell out of one of the trees he'd planted. Now, even though Lou had dropped out of high school, he wasn't a fool. He knew boxing, and he also knew Lou Jenkins. Lou Jenkins, who was called the Sweetwater Swatter, was a tough-as-nails lightweight. He got his start by travelling the country and fighting in carnivals. He would go on to win the world lightweight title by beating Lou Ambers at Madison Square Garden in New York City in 1940. Jenkins also served in the US Coast Guard during World War II and was involved in the D-Day invasion. He was as tough as a $2 steak. He was also a reckless guy in his personal life, quite literally. He drank too much and rode motorcycles, or better yet, he crashed them, and cars, all the time. Jenkins defended his world lightweight title against Sammy Angnot while recovering from a neck injury that he got after crashing his motorcycle. Even with a bad neck, Jenkins went the full 15 rounds before losing the decision and the title in points. In 2003, the Ring magazine actually voted him among the greatest punchers of all time. So, in Lou's head, he thought, well, I could have used that $50, but it wasn't worth taking the risk and taking a world-class beating from a future champion. So he told the guy to forget about it. The day he was supposed to fight Jenkins, conveniently, he got sick. Well, that's what he told everybody. Lou said, we were planting trees and we were building roads by day and he was hustling by night, boxing and playing craps. I was only 16, passing myself off as an 18-year-old. It was great. I was doing whatever I wanted and getting paid for it. But nothing lasts forever. And after 2 years, when I legitimately turned 18, my time with the CCC was up and I had to go back to New Jersey. Along the way, I'd gained some good job skills. I could now drive a truck, and the correspondence courses taught me a few office skills. Plus, I'd gotten actually better as a boxer. Now I could be a truck driver, an office boy, or a boxer. So I had options. Lou was released from the CCC in 1940, quickly returning to New Jersey. He arrived with a suitcase full of knowledge, better hustling skills, and a stronger desire to succeed. Upon his return, he immediately reassociated with the same group he was hanging around with before he left. Lou explains what the gang's dynamic was like, and he said, I called them my Goombas. My main goober was Lou Cuccinello. Lou was a football star and a baseball player at East Side High School and was teammates with Larry Doby, who would become the first African-American to play baseball in the American League. Larry went through some tough times integrating those sports, especially with the Indians. Just like Jackie Robinson with the Brooklyn Dodgers, Larry had all the same racial slurs thrown at him every ballpark that he went to. We always supported him. Larry, Lou, Cooch and I were good friends, and that's what friends do. We always encouraged each other, whether it was baseball or football. They would come to Lou's football games when he played on the weekends for the Dublin Tornadoes. Dublin was the section of Paterson where he lived at the time, and when he fought, they were always there to cheer him on. After getting back from his CCC job in Walla Walla, he began boxing training a lot more seriously. He was still learning how to box, so he was competing as an amateur, and he had filled out to 147 pounds by this point and would be competing as a welterweight in the New Jersey Diamond Gloves tournament. He said, I'm not going to say that I was the next Sugar Ray Robinson, but I certainly held my own. I won the Diamond Gloves welterweight title in 1940, so I thought I had a promising career in the sport. Watching the crowds for the matches and how much they were enjoying themselves, I was beginning to fall deeply in love with the sport. There were always some kind of action around the fights, and I always gravitated towards it, whether it be boxers nervously shadow boxing in the dressing room, or wise guys making side bets ringside, or families cheering for a brother or a father who was fighting. Irishmen rooting for their brethren against an Italian or a whole neighbourhood cheering for the guy from down the block. I was always comfortable around athletes, particularly boxers, and I always admired the courage, toughness and dedication of my older brother. Boxing, training, watching, cheering, well, it was exciting. I always felt so alive around the sport. That restless feeling would always get pushed to the back when I was around boxing. It was that feeling of not doing anything to get ahead, because I knew there was always something to do, something new to learn, something to fill in the gaps of life. Plus, it allowed me to polish my hustling skills and try to build something that could help me take care of my family. Yes, it was the beginning of a love affair that will last for more than 7 decades. Like all good love stories, something always comes in between the two lovers before they can truly connect. For me, the thing standing in my way, well, it was a biggie. America entered World War II in 1941, and me and my buddies from the Dublin section of Paterson felt the pull of doing our patriotic duty, so I enlisted into the US Army in 1941. Lou carries on to say, "My small group of friends and I were always aware of the war that was going on in Europe, as it was influencing our relatives and friends in the old country. But it wasn't something that was going on in our backyard, so life for us went on as usual. I had started working in my uncle's bakery shop and driving trucks and delivering pastries. While the bakery was my main source of income, I was still training in the evening and boxing in tournaments and playing offensive tackle for the Dublin Tornadoes semi-pro football team on the weekends. Since returning from the CCC, I had fallen into a steady routine. Well, that routine was knocked upside down after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It threw the Americans into World War II. There was a lot of patriotic spirit among me and my friends at the time, and we all felt it was our duty to defend the country that had given us everything that we had. Plus, we were all fighters by nature. A few of my close friends joined the Navy and ended up on the USS Giardello and were killed at the Battle of Guadalcanal. The ship was built by the Federal Shipbuilding Company in Kearney, New Jersey, and launched in 1941. A Japanese submarine torpedoed and sunk the ship, killing 687 men, including the 5 Sullivan brothers. They were brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, who had joined the Navy with the agreement that they could all serve together. The military had a policy of not having brothers serve together, but it wasn't really enforced. After they were killed, the military strongly enforced its sole survivor policy. The Sullivan brothers were actually mentioned in the movie Saving Private Ryan. Now, because I had been a truck driver in the CCC, I enlisted into Army Ordnance. I figured this would put me on the front lines of the battle in Europe. So my first stop for induction was at Fort Dix in New Jersey. After they processed me, I was shipped off to basic training in Jackson, Mississippi. And I thought going to Walla Walla was like travelling to another planet. Jackson, in 1941, well, it was like stepping into a time machine and going back 100 years. The attitude of locals towards other races was foreign to me. Plus, they didn't really like people from the north, or Yankees as they thought of us. I had been raised around all types of people, and, being part of an immigrant family, I knew discrimination. Racism and those types of attitudes never sat right with me. I treated people of every race the way they treated me, and that's the way I wanted to be treated. But being from Jersey, it was bound to happen that I'd run headlong into the ugly face of racism in Jackson. I went through basic training without any major incidents. Most of my training was spent working out and learning my role in the army. I was already in decent shape from boxing and playing football before I enlisted. We didn't get our first weekend furlough until we had finished our 6 weeks of training. To say we were looking to blow off some steam, well, that was an understatement. And there were 12 of us who had shipped down together from Jersey, and we were all looking to have a good time. The base was a good distance from Jackson, so we had to take a service bus into the city. We figured we could go into town, find a nice bar, have a few drinks, a few laughs, and get back to the base without much trouble. Fat chance of that. We weren't rowdy, troublemakers or wise guys, but we liked to talk loudly. Again, we weren't making trouble, but we had a lot of pent-up frustrations from 6 weeks of taking shit from officers who were trying to whip us into combat shape. Our northern attitudes might not have played well in the South in 1941, but so be it. Plus, we were Jersey guys, which meant we weren't going to back down if trouble came our way. Sometimes you don't have to go looking for trouble. It comes to you. Well, that was certainly the case on this day. It was a hot, muggy day, one of those steamy days that you only get in the south where the heat makes the sweat soak through your shirt and stick to your skin like a piece of plastic wrap. When my friends and I got on the service bus, it was already crowded, but a few of us managed to find seats. At one of the stops, a group of elderly black women who worked on the base got on the bus. "It looks like you ladies have worked harder than us today, so why don't you take our seats?" I said to the elderly black ladies. I should have taken a cue from the look on the ladies' faces that something wasn't exactly right by that offering. They reacted with surprise that someone was giving up the seats. The issue, though, wasn't that someone was giving up the seats, it was that someone white was giving up the seats. What we took as a courteous gesture, the locals saw as a crime against society, like walking around naked or pissing on someone's shoes. We'd got up to give the ladies our seats, which immediately caught the attention of the white bus driver. He brought the bus to a quick stop and he got up in my face. "Hey, what are you doing?" "I'm giving my seat to this lady, who needs it more than me," I said, trying to explain my actions. The driver's reply, "Well, we don't do this kind of thing down here." "Well, where I'm from, in New Jersey, we do that kind of thing because it's the right thing," I said, without backing up or backing down. I was a hothead, and it didn't take much to push my buttons. Plus, with my boxing ability, I knew I could drop that redneck like a 10-pound bag of flour if I had to. By now, things were getting as heated on the bus as the temperature outside. You got my northern buddies jawing at the southern rednecks and a group of 90-day wonders, the lieutenants, who were taking the side of the rednecks, yelling and pointing at each other. We called the lieutenants Louis, and they were barking at us like angry pit bulls. They just wanted to flex their military muscles. Stripes and ranks aside, we weren't afraid of them. We could take them down as well. "Didn't you hear the man? We don't do that down here," one of the MPs said. "Now get back over there and you sit back down now, or I'm calling the military police." All of us soon spilled off the bus. Well, that Louis, that was in my face, was a wise guy, and he started poking me in the chest with his finger and pushing me back. Before long, there was a lot of pushing and shoving between both sides. All I could hear was, "We don't do that kind of thing down here." Then suddenly, somebody threw a punch. Well, that was it. That was the only opening I needed. I swung on the bus driver first, wanting to shut his big, drawling mouth. It was a perfect shot, and I sent him into outer space. Punches were flying back and forth as we were trying to deck as many rednecks and Louis as we could before the MPs could arrive. Once the MPs and cops showed up, they settled the dust for us. And they really weren't there trying to sort out the differences or figure out who was right. The MPs just cuffed me and my buddies and took us straight to the brig. Because we were at war, no one was getting booted out of the army, especially after you'd just gone through your basic training. I spent 3 days in the brig before our captain found out about the incident. His name was Cap Hollywood, and he was from New Jersey like the rest of us. He liked me because I was involved in boxing and was popular around the base. Lucky for us, they didn't bring any charges against us, so there was no court-martial on charges of inciting a riot or striking a superior officer. But we did have to make a deal. We had to leave Jackson, Mississippi, and ship out to Fort Hood in Texas. The bus incident taught me 2 lessons. Always stand up for what you believe in, and you don't always have to use your fists to get your point across. But for a hothead like me, it took a few years to learn that last lesson. Jackson had had enough of me, and I'd had enough of Jackson. Shipping off to Fort Hood was like an early Christmas gift in my mind. At this point, Lou thought this was where he was going to make his entry into the war, where he was going to be defending his great country. They'd given him a job, and he was certain that it was going to send him to where all the action was happening. And his job title, well, it was officially Tank Destroyer Driver. A tank destroyer was an armoured vehicle used on the front lines in World War II to do what it said, destroy tanks. There was a need for tank destroyers with the war going full steam in Europe, and Lou was certain that he was going to get shipped overseas for combat. When Lou arrived at Fort Hood, he was ready for shell and fire, ready to battle the world. Imagine his surprise then when he found himself in the kitchen. He was preparing meals for guys in his unit who weren't assigned to fight. Of course, That situation was massively disappointing for Lou, and he said, "It turned out that the captain of our unit had no desire to see combat. He was one of those guys in the military that had political connections and had worked out an arrangement with someone in power to stay stateside at Fort Hood, and lucky me, was locked down stateside with him. We were in ordnance and cleaning up the camp. Instead of driving a tank destroyer, I was driving a garbage truck. After thinking about what had happened to those guys on the USS Giardello, I guess I was lucky that I didn't see combat. Plus, I had a pretty cushy gig. We had a really light work duty, which was fine with me because it freed me up to do what I like to do most, work with the boxers. This is when I began to take training seriously. I was named the boxing instructor for the camp, which was a big deal, as these army bases took pride in how good their boxing teams were. I was working with 8 guys in our camp who were pretty good, and we'd box guys from other camps. It was very good competition, especially when I could tell that most of these guys had an amateur background. On the other side of our camp was a group of black boxers. As the army was still segregated in those days, all my boxers were white. While we didn't have any official interaction with the black boxers, I would sneak over to their unit sometimes and work with them as well. Some of those guys from Florida I kept in touch with after I left the army. Most of my time was spent working in the kitchen. I was able to take care of a lot of kids, making sure they got enough to eat. I was also getting better as a boxing trainer, a lot better than I was while I was in the CCC, getting guys ready for those barroom smokers. It may have also been because now I was working with guys who had actual amateur backgrounds. 3 years in the army, I never saw a minute of combat, but I still got some valuable experience as a boxing coach. It was the beginning of laying the groundwork for my future in the sport. I loved working with the boxers, teaching them how to box and motivating them to give their all. It was very rewarding to see how they progressed from training through the matches. Even though I enjoyed training, I was still young and I still had the desire to get in the ring and work on my own boxing career. When I arrived back home to Paterson after leaving the army, I had a clear idea of what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a professional boxer. I didn't know exactly how I was going to get there, but I was sure that my brother Carl would help. While it would take a lot of hard work to get where I wanted, there was one good thing for me that I had going. I was never afraid of working hard. So, after spending 3 years in the army, working in the mess hall, cleaning up the camp, and training boxers, Lou had developed a solid work ethic. Constantly being on the go was part of his day-to-day life. Working hard never bothered him. He knew it was a gateway to something more, a means to an end. By combining work and life experiences, the outline of a business plan came into shape upon his return to Paterson. With an aptitude for trucking since his days in the CCC, that was bolstered by the army. The military trained Lou to drive all types of big trucks and tanks, and there wasn't anything on 4 wheels that he couldn't drive. He said, "I knew that there was money to be made in the trucking business, as people always needed something moved from one place to another. My first job out of the army was driving trucks with H.W. Mills, which was a hardware company in Paterson. For 4 years, I was behind the wheel delivering nails to construction sites. After banging out jobs for them, I started to think, why not go into business for myself? My first deal with the company, W.H. Mills, who owned the truck and leased it to me as an independent contractor. That was working fine for a while until another thought hit me. Wouldn't it be better to buy my own truck and cut out the middleman? Well, the first truck in the Lou Duva fleet was a pickup truck. A trucking licence, $300, was all it took for Lou to operate his own business. Then came expansion. By getting more trucks and hiring a couple of his fighters to drive the trucks and work along with him, it meant that he could do more business. He also knew a few trucking companies who would get loaded up with deliveries, and then they would ask Lou to step in and take some of them off their hands. In the meantime, his brother was working in the dye house, and he also helped Lou get some business there. That company, it gave Lou a shot at delivering piece goods to New York. His first big contract was with the Pullman Company, delivering fabrics and goods. That contract allowed Lou to expand even more. Pullman was a big clothing company at 1412 Broadway in Manhattan, and they delivered goods from Paterson to the New York area. Because sometimes you needed a place to store goods before you could deliver them, that led Lou to then invest into the warehouse business, with the opening of a huge storage space on 4th Avenue in Paterson. He said my brothers and the in-laws were working in there, as were the guys who were going out with my sisters. Well, all these various businesses and expansions allowed Lou to keep hiring relatives and boxers that he worked with. Everything for Lou became a family affair. Some people think it's more trouble than what it's worth to hire relatives and friends. Well, that was never the case with Lou. Maybe it's just the Italian way. You can trust your relatives, and by helping them, you're helping yourself. Everyone is happier when they've got a job, and if you have a job to offer them, well, you don't have to hear them gripe about not having a job when you get together for Sunday dinners. Besides, they may have enough money to pick up the tab at the bar every now and then. Now, even though Lou knew guys in the Teamsters being the largest union in America concerned with the employment rights of truckers, nothing he was doing was much of the union's business. As such a small company, they were allowed to operate without being forced to join the union. Another plus was in hiring the fighters was that the connections they were able to make in the garment business, and Lou said, the delivery elevator operators at the factories would recognise some of my fighters and would help me out quite a bit in getting us in and out quickly so that we could stay on schedule and manage more deliveries. It was when I expanded to 8 trucks that the Teamsters Local 560 finally came calling. It was one of the biggest unions and was run by one Tony Provenzano. Now, Provenzano was a short, stocky guy who had been an amateur boxer growing up in Manhattan. After quitting school at 17, he took a job as a truck driver out of the Hackensack, New Jersey terminal for $10 a week in 1934. He clawed his way to the top to become president of the local 560 in 1958. He was known as a guy that you didn't cross. Tony Pro, as he was known, was one of those colourful wise guys who had power over some big unions in New York and New Jersey at the time. He cited the Fifth Amendment 44 times when testifying before a Senate committee on racketeering charges in 1959, and Robert F. Kennedy was the lawyer for the Senate during those hearings. Also in 1978, Tony Pro was forced out of the Teamsters and later convicted of racketeering and the murder of Anthony Castelli too, one of his union rivals who had disappeared in upstate New York 17 years earlier. Tony Pro died of a heart attack in prison in 1988. He was 71. Well, going back to Lou, and Lou said he never had any problems with Tony Pro or anyone else in the local 560 during that time. He said, he was a good guy to me. Most of those guys liked me because I was involved in boxing. While they never treated me with any disrespect, there was still no avoiding them if you were in any kind of business at that time. Anything that was to be done had to be done with the Teamsters' approval. Even though the trucking business was booming, I eventually ended up with 32 trucks before selling the business. There was still the dream of boxing though, which called to me every day. When I was making deliveries in Manhattan, there was always time built into the schedule to stop by one or two of the popular gyms and see some of the great fighters and trainers. My amateur boxing days were over once I left the army, so being around 20 years old with 60 amateur fights under my belt, of which more was won than lost, well, it was time for me to see how the professional ranks would work out. My brother Carl, who had stopped boxing professionally while I was away in the army, agreed to work with me as something of a manager and help me only if we used his trainer, George Andrews. George had been one of Carl's former fighters and was now joining my brother, who was also working with a lot of other boxers and trainers. Carl started putting me on some small shows in Garfield, Newark, Elizabeth and White Plains. Most of the matches were even, and some weren't. I fought some good fights. I fought some battles where it seemed as though only one fighter would leave the ring alive. I also got knocked on my can. A lot. Let me tell you, there were some pretty good fighters out there in my day, and it seemed like most of them ended up standing across from me every time I stepped into the ring. As far as being a boxer goes, Lou's style was closer to being a slugger and brawler than a ring artist. Being a 5'7" welterweight, you had to be tough, or you'd get run out of the ring on most nights. The focus for Lou was placed on trying to knock a guy's head off and entertain the crowd more than putting on a masterful boxing performance. Fans at the club shows, they didn't like dancers and huggers. They wanted action. Dancing would keep your face pretty, but it wouldn't win you any fans. Lou's face got rearranged plenty from his brief time in the ring. There weren't a lot of pretty boy Floyd Mayweathers operating in Newark and Paterson back then. Lou's last fight was against Joe Parson at the Armory in Miami. They were the undercard, with Norman Hi-Ho Silver billed as the main event. Silver was a popular featherweight from Brooklyn who took off from 1942 to 1944 to serve in the army during World War II. Lou won a 6-rounder in that last fight, which was a good way to go out. He could have won a few more fights if he had trained like he should have trained, but he had so many things going on, that trucking business and helping Carl at the gym in Paterson. He couldn't train the way a real pro trains. For Lou, there was no regret in giving up his boxing career, such as it was. A man's got to know his limitations, he said. My calling was not going to be trading punches. There was a little disappointment in the fact that I wasn't going to be that great welterweight champion. But I've learned that you can't dwell on what didn't happen. You have to keep moving forward. Motivating boxers was more to my liking anyway. Whilst Lou was in his fighting prime, he would become more and more acquainted with the legendary Stillman's gym, spending a lot of time hobnobbing with the many celebrities that graced its filthy floors. Lou describes his love affair with the boxing institution. He said, "You could go in there and find Sugar Ray Robinson hitting the heavy bag next to a 4-round fighter. When they finished their workout, they both had to stand in the same dirty water that collected on the shower floor from the clogged drain. The place didn't do anyone any favours in that way. You climbed a dark stairway to the second floor to get to the gym. There was a guy named Jack Curley who collected 35 cents from everybody who wanted to go inside and watch the action." Lou Stillman, a gruff retired NYPD beat cop, was the owner. He didn't really like the fighters, so he had no problem tossing out anyone that pissed him off, or he thought that didn't belong in the gym. Once you got past Curley and Stillman, and if you could get past the heat and the smell, you were in for a real show. There were 4 rows of chairs set up in front of 2 rings. That's where people, regular everyday people and movie stars, mingled and watched the fighters spar. Cigar and cigarette smoke hung in the air like steam as the grimy, filthy windows always remained closed. If the fighters complained, they were told to go someplace else. Spitting on the floor was mandatory. After all, it was a boxing gym, not a beauty parlour. The gym was always noisy. There were about 6 phones which were always ringing most of the time, with someone on the other line looking for a fighter to fill out a card. Curley would also run the phones. He'd say, "Anybody got a welterweight who can go 6 rounds on Friday night at the Garden?" And you'd get about 8 fighters, managers and promoters all running over to get the phone. There was always something going on at Stillman's, and I always wanted to be in the middle of it. When I was driving trucks and making deliveries in the city, I'd finish as quickly as possible so that I could spend the rest of my day at the gym. I loved the place, but I loved the people more. I was never one of those people who sat in the seats facing the rings. I needed to be behind the rings where the trainers worked, where the smell of liniment and sweat was just like perfume. I talked to trainers like Freddie Brown, Ray Arcel and Charlie Doc Goldman, as well as the managers and promoters. I was getting an education on the business of boxing. The education received at Stillman's, along with the knowledge imparted by his brother Carl, was utilised until Lou's retirement in 1945. It was shortly following this that the hard-working Duva would meet the love of his life, his wife Inez. Being a single man with the pressures of entrepreneurship on his shoulders meant that Lou often played as hard as he worked. Lou enjoyed singing, dancing and generally entertaining people as his outlet of choice. Lou felt that if he could help someone in the process, it was even better. A couple of nights a week, Lou would put on minstrel shows at the Grammar School 18 in Riverside, whereby the fateful meeting took place. And he speaks of this time in his book, A Fighting Life, My 7 Decades in Boxing. And he wrote, "One night, one of the solo singers, Olga Rizzio, brought her kid sister, Inez, along for the show. Inez was there to help her get dressed and put on her makeup. She was a beautiful dark-haired girl with a great figure. It was hard to believe she was still attending East Side High School. She caught my eye in the wings of the stage during my comedy routine. At the end of the act, rushing past her off stage, I grabbed her arm. 'Don't go anywhere. I'm going to marry you.' 'What? You're crazy,' she said as she ran away from him off stage. That's what she must have thought with me dressed like a lunatic clown and proposing marriage without knowing her name or never having really met her. Well, it was only said half kidding. The serious part of me got her address from Olga to follow up. A couple of weeks later, we were dating. On our first date, we went to a hotel in East Orange to see a musical show. After the show, we went dancing. It was a triple date, as my friends Lou Duva and Giardello Conslavo, who was a golf pro, tagged along with their girlfriends. It was a great evening, as we all got to know one another. It went along like this every week for a year. Eventually, the real proposal came around a year after the fake proposal. Inez and I were married at the Ducks Club on November the 6th, 1949, which just so happened to be Inez's birthday. Lou Cooch was my best man, and my groomsmen were boxers. Lou Savold, Johnny Giuliano, Inez's sister Olga was the maid of honour. It was, without a doubt, the best day of my life. Inez became my greatest partner in life. She was by my side in everything that I did. Aside from being there as my wife, she also ran the office during the trucking company heydays, as well as being the secretary and bookkeeper at the Teamsters Local 286 offices. While our first place was in Clifton, we later upgraded to a beautiful home in Ottawa, New Jersey, and settled in to start our lives together in 1954. It was a good part of town with a well-regarded grammar school for kids. There was a lot of good people in the community who always went out of the way to help others. They raised money for charities and organised food drives. Well, in the meantime, whilst marital love blossomed, Lou Duva was busy building a boxing business. He opened a gym in Paterson and he asked Lou to join him in running it, working with the boxers. It was a hot spot for local boxers to train. You had fighters like Fritzy Pruden, Lisa Vold, Johnny Giuliano and Jimmy Flood who frequented the ranks. Fritzy Pruden was from Canada and was the Canadian welterweight champion before relocating to Paterson. He had a devastating left hook, which became his signature punch. He fought some of the best fighters of his day, including Bo Jack, Kid Gavilan, Paddy Young and Ike Williams. He held the distinction of never being knocked down in 10 years as a pro. Another one of the fighters in the gym was Lee Savold. Lee Savold was a heavyweight from Minnesota who held the ring moniker, the battling bartender, because he also worked as a bouncer and a bartender when he wasn't in the ring. Savold set the record for the quickest knockout in a main event at Madison Square Garden when he knocked out Gino Buonavino in 54 seconds in 1948. Savold, in a notable fact, was the underdog and had taken the fight on 48 hours' notice after Joe Baxter had injured his ankle and couldn't fight. Well, that record stood until Jerry Cooney equalled it by knocking out Ken Norton in 1981. It was finally broken when Sultan Ibrahimov KO'd Javier Mora in 46 seconds at the Garden in 2007. The last two fights of Savold's career were 6-round TKO losses to Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano. He retired in 1952. With such names frequenting the gym, Lou's hopes of a stable future in boxing were high and very viable. The viability of Duva's career in boxing was substantiated further after years of hard graft when he was afforded the opportunity to promote world's middleweight champion Joey Giardello's title bout against Nigeria's Dick Tiger. Joey was born Carmine Tilele in Brooklyn, the son of a sanitation foreman. He was 15 years old when he changed his name by buying a cousin's birth certificate for $2 to join the army as an underage recruit. He made 29 jumps as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division before his parents discovered his dishonesty, garnering recruitment and had him discharged. Though he was born in Brooklyn, Joey was raised in South Philadelphia. He loved to fight, but he hated to train. His idea of getting in fighting shape was eating macaroni and cheese dinners, chased down with a beer and supplemented by a few cigarettes over a game of gin rummy with his friends. Most of those friends weren't earning legitimately sourced money, and such relationships would force Joey down a similar path for a time. He got into some trouble after an argument with a gas station attendant went awry early in his pro career. Joey, who was 24 at the time, was on crutches at the time of the altercation, and he cracked the attendant over the head with one of the walking aids. The attendant was injured, and Joey spent 4 months in jail. A natural fighter, Joey was able to get away with not training. He didn't even start to get serious about training until he became a middleweight contender in 1960 upon fighting Utah's Gene Fulmer on April the 20th, 1960 for the National Boxing Association World Middleweight Championship. The fight ended in a draw. Joey thought Fulmer was one of the dirtiest fighters he'd ever fought, and once said that Fulmer was the only fighter that he couldn't take a liking to. The two combatants deliberately traded headbutts in the fight. Joey lost 4 of his next 6 fights as the competition and the contenders toughened, with more on the line. In the run-up to meeting Dick Tiger for the WBA and WBC World Middleweight title, Joey won 8 of his next 10 fights from September 61 to June of 63 against some of the heaviest hitters in the middleweight division, including a 10-round decision against Henry Hank in a match that was voted the 1962 Fight of the Year by the Ring magazine. Joey's most acclaimed win during that run of fights actually came against the great Sugar Ray Robinson. Many felt that Joey had the advantage prior to the contest because Robinson may have drained himself at the weigh-in due to an unusual fear of passenger lifts. Robinson feared riding in them, and so, even though the weigh-in for the fight was conducted on the 12th floor of the Philadelphia Inquirer building, Sugar Ray actually walked all the way up the 12 flights of stairs for the weigh-in and walked back down again on the day of the fight. Giardello would knock down Robinson in the 4th round on his way to a unanimous 10-round decision victory. The championship fight that Lou promoted was the 3rd time that Joey and Tiger had met in the ring. They had fought twice in 1959 within a 2-month span, with Tiger taking the first fight on a 10-round unanimous decision in Chicago and Joey taking the second match on a 10-round unanimous decision in Cleveland, Ohio. Dick Tiger was born Richard Etu in Amibago, Nigeria in 1929. He was a quiet, soft-spoken man, but fierce in the ring. His meek-looking exterior made him the target of bullies when he was growing up, forcing him into repeated conflict, which steered him towards boxing to fight back. He built up a reputation as a good street fighter, and the way he attacked opponents in the ring led him to getting the nickname Tiger. According to legend, some British officers were watching him fight in Nigeria, with one of them commenting on the way that he jumped in the air and punched his opponent that made him look like a tiger. When he was 19 years old, Tiger started boxing in club shows which were organised by the British military officers in his hometown of Amibago. As his skills improved, promoters began noticing, and he turned pro in 1952, becoming a major attraction in his native Nigeria. After cleaning out the compatriot competition, Tiger moved to Liverpool in England when he was just as successful. In 1958, in his 40th professional fight, he won the British Empire, now known as the Commonwealth title. It wasn't long before Tiger travelled to test his mettle on American shores. He took New York by storm, becoming an instant fan favourite with the Madison Square Garden crowds. Tiger had some of his greatest fights at the Garden, specifically those against Emil Griffith, Joey Archer, Jose Torres and Bob Foster. In 1962, Tiger's form won him Fighter of the Year from the Ring magazine, beating the likes of Sonny Liston, Emil Griffith, Carlos Ortiz and Muhammad Ali to the prestigious accolade. In the same year, Joey Giardello was in the Fight of the Year, fatefully placing the two fighters on a collision course. Now, Lou Duva speaks of his sizable promotional assignment in the autobiography. He said, "As soon as we reached an agreement to promote the fight, we got to work. It wasn't very difficult to put the match together, as we easily came to an agreement with Tiger's people on a contract. We knew it wouldn't be hard to sell tickets. It was a damn good middleweight championship fight between two guys who weren't going to be ballroom dancing in the ring. Plus, we had two former heavyweight champs to help us push tickets, as Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis both agreed to play host on fight night. That meant all the bigwigs who came out would get a chance to rub elbows with boxing royalty. Though Joey didn't like to train, he went right to work in preparation for Tiger. He knew this might be his last chance to win the middleweight title, so he went all in. He went to a 9-week training camp to prepare. Joey was legendary at avoiding training for fights. All of his trainers, Joe Polino, Adolf Ritaco and Arnold Giovanetti, knew that they would have to chase him down to get him in the gym. But Ritaco said once you got him there, he would give you everything he had. Joey trained at the Paterson gym in South Philly on the corner of Moore and Paterson. The boxing gym was on the 3rd floor and J&D Billiards Parlour was on the 4th. It was where guys gathered to smoke, drink, play pool and place wagers on sporting events of the day. Joey had his own private pool cue with a red binding. If you weren't serious about trading, you'd find yourself spending more time on the 4th floor than on the 3rd. To prepare for Tiger, he had to spend more time on the 3rd, and he did. We knew that Joey would have to win over the doubters, as most newspapermen thought his time had passed. He was a 33-year-old contender who had an up-and-down career with over 120 professional fights, plus he was a dancer and a mover as opposed to a heavy puncher, which Tiger was. But Joey warned his critics to be careful about counting him out and set a course for proving them all wrong. The place was jam-packed with loud, crazy fans. There were bets being placed right, left and centre, but no one seemed to notice or care. Joey was an underdog to Tiger, a 5'8" stocky powder keg. Tiger was slow and plodding, but relentless in putting pressure on his opponents. Joey was a mover in the ring, but he had a good chin and could take a shot if he got caught. After all, he was a slick veteran who knew how to stay out of trouble. And that's the way the fight unfolded. Joey kept moving away from Tiger, sticking him with a jab, and Tiger kept stalking him for 15 rounds, looking to land something that would send Joey into outer space. It worked out exactly how Joey had mapped it out. He wanted to start with a slow pace, speed up during the middle of the fight, and then keep away from Tiger if he got desperate towards the end. Joey's trainers, Giardello and Riccotto, came up with that strategy, a concession to Joey's age and ring mileage. There were a couple of characters. Riccotto was 5'2" and had been the Middle Atlantic flyweight champion for 2 years between 1937 and 1939, and said he would have been a jockey if he had been raised around the racetrack. Riccotto, who served in World War II, had tattoos of the 12 battles that he had been involved in, which included places like Guadalcanal, Fiji and Bougainville. Some of the names and places were misspelled. He didn't know nothing, Riccotto said of the guy who did the tattoos. Giardello was more of a manager to Joey. He was a snappy dresser with neatly combed hair who always made sure he worked the corner, especially if TV cameras were around. Giardello, who had ties to organised crime, disappeared in August of 1977. His Cadillac was found at the Philadelphia airport, but his body was never found. Riccotto and Giardello knew Joey inside and out, and they made sure he was ready for Tiger. They knew exactly how Joey needed to fight to win. To go in and fight it out would have been suicidal, Joey said. It was mainly because no one gave him a chance to win. Joey was a 3-1 underdog. Maybe everyone had seen him fight to a bloody draw against Gene Fulmer in Fulmer's backyard of Bozeman, Montana. Everyone thought that Tiger would maul him the way Fulmer had. But Joey had gotten himself in great shape and was able to use his elusiveness and speed to stay away from Tiger's attacks. During the fight, whenever his trainer, Arnold Giovannetti, yelled, "Jersey Joe," Joey was supposed to dance around and do the Jersey Joe Walcott-style fadeaway to show that he still had fresh legs and could move. He was still doing it into the 15th round. It was just the second time in his 15-year career that he'd gone the distance in a match. Joey looked fresh when he came out for round 15, and he popped Tiger with a quick 8 punches and then danced away. That's when everyone knew that he was going to win the World Middleweight Championship. Referee Paul Cavalier, the only judge, scored the fight for Joey, giving him the decision and the Middleweight Championship. It was one of the most exciting moments of Lou's career in boxing. He'd had his first world champion, and thankfully Joey was the first of many more to come. After the fight was over, they were standing under the stands taking it all in. We're rich, I screamed to Murray and Sam. Turns out we weren't rich, he said. We didn't make any money. At best, we broke even. How could that happen? No one told us that there was a parking garage under the building with a large bay door leading into the arena. Apparently someone had left the doors open, and a lot of people, they just walked right in without paying. Or maybe someone was working that door for themselves and palming $10 to let people in. That guy probably made a ton of money. I know we sure didn't. The place was full all right, but not from paying customers that we sold tickets to. We didn't know anything about the open door situation until we went to the box office to count the receipts. Talk about a mood killer. The mood improved when we all met up for a party afterwards at the 500 Club that was run by Paul Skinny D'Amato, who was also known as Mr. Atlantic City. His joint was off the boardwalk on Missouri Avenue and was the place to be. A lot of wise guys, politicians and sports stars hung out there because there was always some kind of action, whether it be gambling or drinking, going on. D'Amato was Frank Sinatra's guy for years. They were such good friends that Sinatra would do about 5 shows a year at the 500 Club, even when he became Frank Sinatra. It was so good that it almost took the sting away from not making any money of the show. Per Joey's contract, we had the option on his next fight, but he came to us after the Tiger bout and begged to get out of the deal. Murray Goodman, the former Madison Square Garden PR man, whose newly formed promotional company helped me promote the championship fight, listened to what he had to say, and we tore up the contract and we let him go. After that, they followed his career, but didn't promote any more of his shows. There was initial talks of doing an immediate rematch with Tiger. Joey, who had been so grateful for the opportunity Tiger had given him, said that he wanted to return the favour, but it would be almost 2 years before it happened. Joey's managers wanted to milk the title, and they started talking about all kinds of different fights for him overseas. There was talk of him fighting Hungarian contender Laszlo Papp in Vienna and Italian star Nino Benvenuti in Italy, but nothing ever came of it. He did fight and beat a tough club fighter named Juan Carlos Rocky Rivera twice in 1964 before agreeing to defend the title against Rubin Hurricane Carter. Carter, of course, became famous or infamous after he was convicted of murder in the killing of 3 people at a bar in Paterson, New Jersey in 1966 and was sentenced to life in prison. He claimed innocence and that he'd been framed by the police. He got a lot of people involved in his case and, after almost 20 years behind bars, got the case thrown out and was released from prison. You can listen to that particular episode on Rubin Carter on our Darker Side of Boxing podcast. Now, as a boxer, Carter was a rough character, taking no prisoners in the ring. He had stopped both Emil Griffith and Florentino Fernandez inside of a round. He fought like a buzzsaw and was even more aggressive and dangerous than Tiger was. It was Joey's first title defence, and he would get an opportunity to do it in his hometown of Philadelphia. Carter came into the ring with the same mean, intimidating attitude that he had always had, but Joey wasn't backing down. Carter landed a couple of solid rights to Joey's head in the early rounds, but Joey took them pretty well. After that, Joey kept Carter at the end of his jab and used his legs to stay away. By the 5th round, Joey was cruising to a unanimous decision over Carter. Now, going back to the Tiger fight, and by the time he got around to giving him the rematch, he just wasn't the same fighter. He was letting himself go more than he'd ever done before, and it was harder for him to shed the weight to get down to the middleweight limit of 160 pounds. At this point, he was 35 years old by the time he got in the ring at Madison Square Garden in 1965, almost 2 years since their previous bout. So to make weight, Joey starved himself the last 48 hours before the fight. By now, he was walking around at 190 pounds. Because of that, as well as poor training and age, Joey couldn't move as well as he did on the night he won the title. Tiger rocked him hard with a left hook in the 2nd round and was in total control for the rest of the fight, winning by unanimous decision and reclaiming the middleweight title. Joey had only held the title for 22 months. Joey took the defeat badly, but decided to fight 4 more times rather than retire on a loss to Tiger. Battling his weight issues caused by poor discipline, he decided to move up to the light heavyweight division. As a boxer without concussive punches, the move was a hindrance to further career success for Joey. After beating Cash White in September of 1966, he fought Nate Collins in San Francisco and was beaten badly. The referee stopped the fight in the 8th round as Collins was unloading a barrage of unanswered blows. Joey's career finally came to an end on November the 11th, 1967, after losing a lopsided decision to a prospect named Jack Rogers in Pittsburgh. He came back one last time, around 6 months later, and beat Rogers by split decision. Trading, promoting, and trucking, well, that was now Lou's daily bread. With solid pros working at the gym and a world title list in his ranks, Lou Duva's gym became the perfect place to soak up quality boxing education. Lou said, "This became a running theme in my life from that point forward. Every job had to provide the finances to keep my boxing ventures going and provide for my family. During the height of my success with the trucking business, we made a $5,000 profit in 1 month, and that money went right back into shows at the Paterson Armory and the Kennedy High School in Paterson." Lou would then sell the trucking business in the early 1960s after compiling a successful fleet of 32 vehicles. With an eye for a dollar and a good head for business, Lou's next professional venture would come as a bail bondsman, a career that saw his boxing contacts being utilised to his benefit. And he recounts this episode of his life in his autobiography. He said, "It seemed to me that I was the man of Paterson in those days, almost as if I could get away with anything. I knew all the cops, the politicians and the mayors. You had to know those guys to succeed in any kind of business. That helped me especially when I got into the bail bonds business. Being friendly with cops, bookmakers and lawyers was the perfect combination to start this business. All of them would say, 'Lou, you know everybody, why don't you get into the business?' Once I got involved, the calls flooded in from friends of mine who had gotten locked up for everything under the sun, but mainly for bookmaking. Sometimes I had to even bail out my own boxers. A few would knock around their wives and girlfriends, and others would get into alcohol-related car incidents. They'd call me when put on bail, and I'd have to go to the police station where they got locked up, usually Newark or Passaic. The bail bonds office was located on Washington Street in downtown Paterson, which was across from the police station and above a donut shop. It was convenient for a couple of reasons. One, you could always get snacks and you didn't have far to walk to deal with the clients. And two, the detectives would always call, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning. The company was called ABC Bail Bonds. Bill Marotta already owned the business, and I joined as a partner. His brother, Ace Marotta, had been my cutman during my boxing days. They were both good, upstanding guys, the kind you trusted in the bail bonds business. Our families also had a tight relationship. You run into all kinds of people in the bail bonds business. I once bailed out Anthony Caponegro, a.k.a. Tony Bananas, who was a made man in the Bruno crime family out of Philadelphia. He operated out of the ironbound section of Newark. I didn't know what he did, but the charges weren't serious. He was hooked up with a group in Philadelphia boxing, and they controlled middleweight Joey Giardello. Of course, I worked with Joey when he fought Dick Tiger for the title in 1965. As far as bailing out Tony Bananas, I did what I had to do, and I let it go. When it comes to bail bonds, you're comfortable bailing out guys you know, as the odds of them running off are slim, but when you don't know them, the odds of them taking off are a lot higher. For those you didn't know, you'd have to have a little talk before issuing the bond. Ironically, one of those people that he issued on bail bond was his former champion, Joey Giardello. And he said to him, "Joey, you better show up for your hearing. If you don't, I blow $5,000 and I'm going to come after you." A couple of days before they must show up in court, Lou said, you put a guy on them and make sure that they're still in town. The day they're supposed to be in court, you make sure that they're in court and have the right lawyer with them, etc. A couple of guys jumped bail on me for $5,000, but luckily for me, other people co-signed for them and they made it up. You didn't want that to happen too often. Most bail jumpers were local guys. Occasionally, there would be a bail jumper that I'd have to chase down over a long distance. The farthest trip to grab a bail jumper took me to San Juan, Puerto Rico. I got a tip that they were staying in some apartment in a barrio in San Juan and were doing business down there. The guy who told me this said we should bring a detective. So I had to pay a detective. Johnny Torres, one of my boxers, also came with me because he was from Puerto Rico and he knew the area and he spoke the Spanish language. He would do all the talking for us. Torres was a tough guy. He fought Nino Benvenuti in Italy in 1965 and lost on a disqualification in the 7th round. I brought Johnny into the company because he knew a lot of guys who were always getting locked up, so it worked two ways. He brought in business and could help me track down bail jumpers if the business he brought in went south. So we all hopped on a plane and flew down to San Juan to grab this guy and bring him back to Paterson. Once we tracked him down, we called the cops and showed them the paper we had from the New Jersey courts that he didn't show up and that he was missing. They helped us pick him up and make sure we put him on the plane back to Jersey. We got to the apartment where he lived and grabbed him right away. As me and Johnny were dragging him out, the people in the apartment above us were throwing garbage down on us and cursing us in Spanish. I wasn't sure we were going to make it out of there alive, as they didn't take too kindly to us coming down there and grabbing this bail jumper. There was another time as well, when there was a bail jumper who skipped out to South Carolina. The guy had been drinking one night and got into a fight, which landed him in jail. We bailed him out, and he skipped town before the trial. Again, a tip came in that the guy was hiding out in an all-black town outside of Beaufort, South Carolina. And do you know who one of the most famous boxers are from Beaufort is? Smoking Joe Frazier. It was the early 1970s, and I was trying to give Joe a quick payday. He was always up for a little odd work here and there, so for $200, I had the best backup you could get for a bail jump run. I'd put a lot of shows on in New Jersey and would use a lot of boxers from Philadelphia. By going to the gyms down in Philadelphia, I met all the boxers from the area. Joe Frazier was as big as he got in those days in Philly. I got to know Joe through his trainer, Yancey Yank Durham. I knew Joe from the time he was in the amateurs. He was a great amateur boxer, and I remember watching him fight Buster Mathis in the US Olympic trials at the 1964 World's Fair in New York. I became friends with Joe over the years from seeing him in the gym and from going to his fights. It's good to have friends in Philly. If you were doing anything in boxing in Philadelphia, you knew Joe. He was the kind of guy that if you needed a favour and he knew you, he'd do everything he could to help. This was a big favour. He said, "Joe, I got to get a guy from your hometown who skipped bail on me. You want to get him with me?" "Well, I've got nothing to do," replied Joe. "I'll come down with you. Let's go." And that was Joe Frazier, ready to go at the drop of a dime. So Joe met Lou in New Jersey, and they flew down to Beaufort, hopped in a car, and drove to the outskirts of town. Now, it wasn't the kind of place you would have wanted to go without Smoking Joe by your side. So imagine this short little Italian guy with a northern accent asking for a black guy in an all-black neighbourhood who had jumped bail in New Jersey. Joe knew exactly where to go to find the guy, and he just zeroed in on him. It was one of the easiest times that Lou had nabbing a bail jumper, because as soon as they saw the guy, he'd come running towards them. He wasn't running away. He wanted to meet Smoking Joe. The guy was so excited about Joe's presence that he hardly even thought about the fact that he was going to jail. All the way back to New Jersey, he just kept saying the same thing. "I can't believe Joe Frazier came to get me." There was another time that Lou said the telephone at the house rang around midnight. And of course, when you're in the bail bonds game, a ringing phone means you're usually about to make some money. The person on the other end of the line was talking about a riot that had happened at the Fabian Theatre in Passaic. After scrambling over to the jail in Newark, it turned out that the Dave Clark Five were being held for causing a riot during a concert at the theatre. Now, this was more than just a bunch of screaming teeny boppers getting excited about some young Hanson singers. This was a full-blown, punches thrown, police called in type of disturbance. The concert was over, and they started getting abuse from some kids. The cops grabbed them up first, and they didn't actually start the riot. The kids on the street started the whole thing. The next day, Lou got the whole thing squashed, and they took off. And he's glad that they did, because it would have been tough going all the way to England to chase down some British rock stars of the time. Lou's oldest daughter, Donna, was a teenager at that time and was familiar with the band. But Lou had no idea why there was some hotshot British rock group touring the US causing a stir everywhere that they went. He just thought that they were nice guys. So, after 10 years of chasing down bail jumpers, Lou then decided on another career change that would run alongside his boxing ambitions. He retained the business, however, delegating the day-to-day running of it to his son-in-law at the time. Van Anastos, Lou's business and family connections are what landed him his next role. The president of Teamsters Local 286. It was 1972, Lou said, and an interesting time to be involved with the Teamsters. It was around that time that Jimmy Hoffa, the head of the Teamsters, was building the union into a powerful force. By 1951, he had built the Teamsters into a union with 1 million members, mainly by recruiting truck drivers and warehousemen throughout the country. But he had to make a lot of deals with the mob to get it done. Some people think that those deals, and his pushing back in some instances, came back to bite him, because he disappeared in 1975 and was declared dead in 1982. Some wise guys were controlling a few of the local unions, and Hoffa was involved with them. Tony Pro, he was still in power when Lou took over the union, but he didn't have any business contact with him. In fact, there was no interaction between Tony Pro and Lou or any wise guys during his time with the union. Lou's real power as boss was in recruiting new members. His brother was in the AFL-CIO union working in textiles and made a connection for Lou with the Teamsters. Lou had to fly to the headquarters in Washington, D.C. to be given the OK as the union's Eastern guy. The guys in Jersey all knew Lou from his days in the trucking business and from coming to some of the local boxing shows that he'd been running. At the time, Lou was probably doing about 6 boxing shows a year. Local 286 was in Passaic and served mostly public service workers, hospital workers, nursing homes and parking authority workers. The union later represented the workers at Martland Hospital and the New Jersey School of Medicine and Dentistry, as well as organising for the workers at the Seine Valley and New Jersey Water Commission. When they first got involved in the union, he brought some of his family members in to help him recruit and organise workers. His daughter Donna was a business agent for the union, and Enos was the bookkeeper. Lou goes on to explain some of the work that they undertook during this time, and he says, "Our work began with 2 nursing homes in Trenton and 2 in the Wayne area. We would go into a nursing home and sit down with the workers and explain how we could make their lives better if they joined the union. We didn't get much resistance from the nursing home owners. Once we got enough members to join, we unionised. It was one of the best jobs that I had because you could see the changes it made in the lives of the people you were helping. Before the union, most of the people were working long hours and weren't making a lot of money. We got them better pay, better healthcare benefits and pensions. For the most part, it was enjoyable work, as the work you did was improving the lives of others. I had learned a long time ago how to deal with different kinds of people and solve problems. There were bad owners and good owners, bad people and good people. We did our job and let them do theirs. Believe it or not, I'm still good friends with one of the nursing home owners. I made sure that we always had a good relationship with the union heads. We found it easier to organise without fighting. We would sit down with them and say, this is what they're getting now, and this is what they should be getting. It was good training for my years of negotiating contracts in the boxing business. I always made sure to have jobs available for my boxers so that they didn't have to depend on their purses from matches to make a living. Giving them a job at a nursing home meant they would have another livelihood, and I always did my best to take care of everybody. Whether it was Henry Norfolk, who would help set up shows for me, or an ambulance driver from Martland Hospital. Sometimes, if we were having trouble organising the workers, I'd have a few of the fighters come down just to make sure there wouldn't be any trouble. If there was, then these were the guys who knew how to handle themselves and keep things from getting out of hand. I would have to go out there in the middle of the night in the 3rd shift and make everyone understand what we were there for. You would think trouble with the law would find me when we had the occasional strike. With the union, my main objective was to stay clear of trouble. My union-inspired temper tantrums were saved for different areas than the picket line. While arguing a call, I nearly set off a riot at a local 286-sponsored Paterson Touch Football League game. Even with working all those different jobs, my hand was still heavy into boxing. I was training a couple of boxers, as well as many others that my brother Carl worked with. Through it all, my family was there to help me try and succeed at a business which I loved. My wife Inez never said a word about all the money that was being flushed down the drain in the name of putting on good boxing shows. She was a very special woman who put up with all my crazy schemes. Amidst the union madness and the wheeling and dealing, the Duvas continued to expand their reach on the boxing landscape. Lou said, we were all over North Jersey with shows. We were at the Gladiator Arena in Totowa, the Paterson Armory, South Orange and Elizabeth. We'd print up flyers, and I'd load the kids in the car and we'd plaster the neighbourhoods. That was our earliest form of promotion. One crazy idea we came up with, well, it was crazy at the time, was to have a woman box on a card at Hinchcliffe Stadium in Paterson 1976. We figured we'd have a good chance at pulling this off, as Aletha Gibson, the former tennis star, was the New Jersey boxing commissioner at the time. She had replaced Jersey Joel Walcott, the former heavyweight champion. She was a good lady, and we had success dealing with her on shows. We found a woman who could box, named Kat Davis. She was a skinny little blonde who packed a punch. She was the first woman boxer to be featured on the cover of the Ring magazine in August of 1978. She came along during the feminist movement, and her boxing was considered a step forward for women's equality. A lot of her matches weren't officially recognised because finding suitable opponents was tricky. She fought one opponent, Margie Dunson, 4 times from 1976 to 1977. The problem with women's boxing at the time was matchmaking. While Kat, who was from Poughkeepsie in New York, was ready to go, we couldn't find a suitable opponent. Wrestling legend Captain Lou Albano suggested we contact Vince McMahon Sr., who had just started gaining notoriety with his wrestling promotion. He went all the way down south to Florida and found a girl who was covered with tattoos, and I can't recall her name, but they sent her up to New Jersey. She was scary, but it didn't bother Kat, as she won decisively by decision. On that same card, we had an opponent who dropped out of the main event. We had lined up a match for Lou Esser, one of our heavyweights from Wayne. Lou had a short amateur career and was 7-1 with 7 knockouts. His only loss came against Sylvester Bump Kelly. He had picked up boxing after his pro football career ended during a tryout with the Miami Dolphins when he suffered a knee injury. He was a local favourite and he could fight well, and he had the personality to win over a crowd. We started looking through the crowd to see if we could find a suitable heavyweight replacement. Lucky for us, we spotted a guy in the audience who had good size, meaning he could fight a heavyweight, and he looked like he could handle himself. It turned out he was a New York City cop and was willing to fight Esser and save the show. A reporter wanted to talk to the cop about the fight, but I told him to just bullshit him away, which he did. He told the reporter that he was from Italy. When the reporter started speaking Italian, the cop was confused. "I don't understand the Italian you're speaking," he said. "Where are you from?" Garofalo asked. The reporter smelled a rat. The next day the newspaper said we had pulled a fast one. If not for that, we would have gotten away with it, especially seeing as Lou knocked out Garofalo in the second round. As I've said numerous times throughout my life, to be successful, you've got to have a gimmick. It always helped getting people in the seat when you had a guy from one neighbourhood fight a guy from another neighbourhood. For the main event, we'd always hold the fight in the neighbourhood of the top guy. One of my top boxers in Paterson in the 1970s was a middleweight named Christy Elliott, who was from Dublin, Ireland. Boy, he could draw a crowd. The Irish boxing fans loved him because he had an aggressive style and he liked to mix it up. We also had a lot of laughs when he did a show, because he was always game for any stunt we used to sell tickets. One of the most memorable matches he was in took place at the Teamsters Local 945, which was down the street from Ice World Skating Rink. We matched him against a guy called Prince Nikita Tahoka from Zaire by the way of Camden. Of course, he wasn't African. He was a garbage man from New Jersey that we had used on some of our prelims. We put him in African-style clothes and smeared some cold cream on his face. The commission told us he had to take it off, but we told them it was for religious reasons. We hired a woman for $50 to dress up in African clothes and hired another guy for $50 to beat a bongo drum as they led him to the ring. It was all made up by us, but the newspapers bought the whole African prince story. Well, the fight was real enough. Christie beat the prince like a drum. A few months later, Mike Rossman fought the prince and flattened him as well. The Gladiator Arena was always a terrific place to hold events. The only problem was that a drunken brawl would always break out before the night was over, and it got so bad that they had the cops on standby to haul off the brawlers. Part of the problem is that they sold beer, and a lot of it. I know this because my son Danny was one of the vendors selling beer and hot dogs. Another time, we held a show at the Elizabeth Armoury on St. Patrick's Day weekend featuring Christie in the main event. We sold a ton of tickets but forgot all about the concession stands. A couple of days before the fight, we were scrambling. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. Give me $25, said Danny. Danny was always the businessman. He needed the $25 to get a permit to sell beer. Before the fight, he'd get beer, hot dogs and peanuts, and with that, he and his brother and sisters took care of the concessions. On the day of the fight, it started to snow. All day long it was getting worse. All we needed was to earn $1,100 to break even on the show. Everything after that was pure profit. We had hired a couple of guys to work the box office and found out that they had started to give refunds on tickets, something that they weren't instructed to do. I guess they caved to the pressure from the people and weather. The night was slowly turning into a disaster. Meanwhile, inside the arena, those fans who decided to stay were drinking beer like there was no tomorrow. They drank so much that Danny ran out and had to send someone to get more. It was snowing even harder outside, but those Irish fans who had come to see Christie were eating, singing and drinking like it was a giant party. The preliminary bouts were pretty good, entertaining enough to keep the crowd warmed up for the main event. And thankfully Christie didn't disappoint the Irish fan base. He was sensational in winning a 10-round decision. With the snow and the refunds, I lost $3,000 on the promotion that night. Meanwhile, Danny and my kids made $5,000 off concessions alone. "Dad, we're going to take the money and go to Miami for the weekend," Danny said. "Okay, wise guys, next time you run the boxing show and I'll run the concessions." Lou's experience working with Joey Giardello when he was world champion would help him understand what it was like to run a big-time promotion. So he called in some favours and he worked his connections and pulled off a major show. It showed him the ropes and it paved the way for doing bigger and better shows in the future with consistent regularity. All the Duvas needed now was a venue for the boxing project to really take shape. And they found it in the form of the Ice World Arena. And that brings an end to part one of the Lou Duva career profile. There's been some great stories here in Lou's life. We've covered his time in the CCC, his time in the army. We've talked about his entrepreneurship with bail bonds businesses and trucking. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff in here that comes away from the boxing side of it. But I think it really adds a lot of context into how Lou is able to negotiate moving forward in his career. Now, of course, we've got to the point now where he's starting to put on shows. They're starting to promote things at venues, but now they need bigger venues. Now they want to go bigger. They want to get more people involved, bigger fighters involved in it. And of course, we will come to that in the second part of his career profile. If you've enjoyed it, please do let us know. On Spotify, leave a comment below. If you're listening on YouTube, leave a comment below. Please make sure you leave a rating and review on Apple or any available podcasting app that allows you to do so. If you're a patron and you've listened to this early, thank you so much for supporting us. And if you do want content like this earlier, then please check us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast. If you can support us, we'd really, really appreciate it. If you can't, just continue to like and share and comment on all the posts that go out across social media. I hope you've enjoyed the episode, guys. A big shout out has to go out, of course, to Jamie Albrecht, the co-host of the show, who curates the episodes and he gets all the great stories, puts them all together in a timeline for us so we can deliver them. So that's why it's probably felt a little story heavy from Lou's part in this first part, because there are so many different things, as I said earlier, that you need to know about Lou's career outside of the sport, which are really pivotal in him becoming successful within the sport. And as we move into part two, we'll certainly be covering more of the boxing side of his career. But we hope that's given you context so far to Lou Duva. Please, again, as we always say, leave us a comment, let us know what you think about it. It really is appreciated. But for now, that is the end of part one of the Lou Duva career profile on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. And we'll see you again soon.